This is the true story of a medieval queen who not only betrayed her husband, the King of England, but also conspired in his downfall and gruesome death. Known forever as the she-wolf of France, Isabella's scandal shocked Europe. What began as a royal marriage turned into one of history's darkest tales of infidelity, humiliation, and blood. In the early years of the 14th century, the kingdoms of France and England stood as two of the most powerful realms in Europe. To strengthen ties between them, a political marriage was arranged between the young French princess Isabella and King Edward II of England. Isabella was only 12 years old when she was sent across the Channel, carrying the hopes of her father, King Philip IV of France, that this alliance would stabilize relations between the two rival nations. But beneath the glittering banners and royal ceremonies, the seeds of tragedy had already been planted. Isabella entered a marriage that was never destined to be one of love or loyalty. From the moment she set foot in Edward's court, she discovered a husband who had little interest in her or in the responsibilities of kingship. Edward II was unlike other kings of his time. His heart and his devotion lay not with Isabella, but with a man named Piers Gaveston. This favorite of the king was showered with wealth, titles, and open affection, while Isabella, the rightful queen, was neglected and humiliated. In a society that valued appearances and dynastic strength, such behavior was more than scandalous. It was dangerous. The French princess, who should have been treated with honor, found herself sidelined in her own court. She was dressed in jewels but stripped of dignity, paraded as a queen while her husband publicly adored another. For Isabella, the humiliation was not just personal but political. Her family in France watched with growing anger as she was dishonored in a foreign land. Yet Isabella was no ordinary woman. She was intelligent, observant, and possessed of a quiet resilience. Though still young, she began to understand the brutal realities of power. She knew that queens who remained passive were often forgotten, while those who seized opportunities could reshape kingdoms. At first, Isabella attempted to play the dutiful wife. She bore Edward children, securing heirs for the throne, and hoped that her obedience would one day earn her respect. But the pattern of neglect continued, and Edward's indulgence in favorites, not only Gaveston but later Hugh Despencer, grew intolerable. These men wielded enormous influence, while Isabella remained a pawn in the game. The betrayal cut deeper than the marriage bed. As queen, Isabella should have been a partner in governance, but instead, she was left powerless. She watched as her husband's incompetence and indulgence dragged England into turmoil. Nobles rebelled, common people suffered, and enemies gathered strength at the borders. The King of England had abandoned his duty, and his queen, in silence, began to nurture her fury. The young girl who had once arrived with hopes of unity was slowly transforming. Humiliation and neglect hardened into resentment. Isolation sharpened her intelligence. Isabella began to realize that her marriage was not a binding chain, but a prison from which she could escape, if only she was willing to embrace betrayal herself. And in the shadows of the English court, she would find the one man who could help her do it: Roger Mortimer, a powerful nobleman whose ambitions matched her own. What began as the story of a forgotten queen was about to become one of the darkest royal scandals of the Middle Ages. Isabella's path would lead not only to adultery, but to rebellion, the overthrow of a king, and a murder so grotesque it would echo through history. For now, Isabella remained the queen in silence, a shadow at court, dismissed by her husband and scorned by his favorites. But the day would come when she would unleash her vengeance, and the world would remember her name not as a victim, but as a predator. The union between Isabella of France and Edward II was intended as a powerful alliance, sealing peace between two rival kingdoms. But in the halls of the English court, the reality of this marriage was far different. Isabella was meant to stand as Queen of England, yet from the beginning she found herself sidelined, her position diminished not by her own failings, but by the king's unshakable devotion to his favorites. Edward's heart belonged not to his young bride, but to Piers Gaveston, a man whose presence would overshadow the Queen's role. Gaveston received honors, lands, and even the gifts meant for Isabella. Such acts were not private indulgences, but public humiliations, signaling to nobles and commoners alike that the Queen held no true place in her husband's affection. In a court where perception was power, Isabella was left diminished, her authority already undermined. Her father, Philip IV of France, was not blind to this treatment. Reports of his daughter's neglect traveled back across the Channel, angering the French court. Yet Isabella endured, hoping her obedience and her role as the mother of heirs would secure her standing. She fulfilled her duty, giving birth to several children, including the much-needed heir, Edward of Windsor. But even as she bore the future of the dynasty, her husband's neglect persisted. For Isabella, the humiliation was compounded by the laughter of courtiers and the whispered scorn of the nobility. To them, she was a powerless figurehead, tolerated but never respected. Gaveston's arrogance only deepened her shame. He flaunted his influence, mocking nobles and treating the Queen with indifference. Eventually, his pride became too great, and the English barons turned against him. In 1312, they captured and executed Gaveston, a moment that briefly seemed to relieve Isabella of her torment. But Edward's weakness as a ruler and his dependency on favorites did not end with Gaveston's death. Another man soon emerged to take his place, Hugh Despenser. Unlike Gaveston, who had been content with influence, Despenser sought domination. His greed was boundless, his cruelty notorious. Under his sway, Edward grew even more distant from his wife, and Isabella's role in court life dwindled further. The Queen had entered her marriage with the grace of a French princess, expecting to wield influence as her mother and grandmother once had. Instead, she was treated as an ornament, discarded whenever the king's desires shifted. What should have been a position of honor became a cage of shame. Yet within this silence, Isabella changed. Each insult, each slight, each reminder of her powerlessness hardened her resolve. She watched as her husband's indulgence and his favorite's greed pushed England toward crisis. The nobility fumed, the people despaired, and the crown weakened. Where once Isabella had suffered humiliation in silence, she now began to see opportunity. Her marriage to Edward had never been a bond of love, but now it ceased even to be a bond of loyalty. Isabella began to drift away emotionally, quietly severing the ties that bound her to the king. She would remain queen in name, but in her heart, she no longer stood beside Edward. It was in this void of affection and loyalty that another figure would rise, Roger Mortimer, a powerful nobleman whose ambitions matched Isabella's own. Their meeting would not only fill the emptiness left by her husband's neglect, but also ignite a scandal that would reshape the destiny of the English crown. Isabella's life at Edward's court had been one of humiliation and neglect. For years she endured her husband's indifference, the arrogance of his favorites, and the whispers of nobles who pitied or mocked her position. But by the 1320s, her silence gave way to something far more dangerous. In the shadows of England's political turmoil, Isabella found both comfort and ambition in the arms of Roger Mortimer. Mortimer was no ordinary courtier. He was a powerful marcher lord, born into one of the most influential families along the turbulent borderlands with Wales. Charismatic, skilled in war, and fiercely ambitious, he represented everything that Edward II was not. Where the king was weak and indecisive, Mortimer was bold and calculating. To Isabella, he offered not only companionship, but also the strength to seize control of her fate. Their affair began in secrecy. Medieval chronicles hint at the scandalous nature of their bond, though the precise details remain veiled in rumor and accusation. What is certain is that Isabella and Mortimer were drawn together by a shared resentment of the king. Edward's reliance on Hugh Despenser had turned powerful nobles into enemies, and Mortimer himself had once rebelled against the crown before being imprisoned. His escape to France brought him into Isabella's orbit at a time when her marriage was broken beyond repair. The betrayal of the royal bed was more than a private sin. For a queen to lie with another man was not simply adultery, it was treason. In a world where kingship rested on the sanctity of lineage, Isabella's affair threatened to stain the crown itself. If her children were suspected of illegitimacy, the stability of the monarchy could collapse. The scandal carried consequences not just for Edward's honor, but for the entire kingdom. Yet Isabella seemed unafraid. Perhaps years of humiliation had dulled her fear of discovery. Perhaps the taste of influence alongside Mortimer awakened a hunger stronger than caution. Together, they forged not just an affair, but a partnership. Their bond was sealed by more than passion. It was cemented by ambition and revenge. The Queen's betrayal became an open secret. Whispers spread across courts in England and France. Reaching even the Pope, chroniclers later condemned Isabella as the she-wolf, a woman who defied not only her husband, but the sacred order of Christian marriage. Yet to others, she appeared as a wronged queen, seizing the justice denied to her by an unworthy king. Mortimer provided the Queen with what Edward never had: respect, attention, and partnership. He listened to her, valued her counsel, and shared her desire to curb the dispenser tyranny that had gripped England. Their intimacy blurred into politics, and their private bond spilled into public rebellion. This was no mere dalliance. Isabella and Mortimer's affair would become the driving force behind one of the most shocking conspiracies of the medieval age: the overthrow of a reigning king. Their union was more than betrayal of the royal bed. It was the creation of an alliance that would drag England into civil war. For Edward II, the Queen's betrayal was a wound deeper than he could imagine. For Isabella, it was liberation. By the time she gave her heart and loyalty to Mortimer, her marriage to Edward had already withered into ashes. What remained was ambition, and the will to see her husband fall. The medieval court was a place of ceremony and spectacle, but behind its glittering facade lay corridors thick with rumor and suspicion. In such an environment, secrets rarely remained hidden for long. Isabella's closeness with Roger Mortimer, though carefully concealed at first, soon became the subject of whispers. To the English nobility, already restless under Edward II's rule, the Queen's betrayal was both scandal and opportunity. The affair began as a murmur, a raised eyebrow at the Queen's correspondence, a noble's quiet observation of her alliances in France. But as Isabella grew bolder, so too did the gossip. Chroniclers would later claim that she no longer attempted to hide her affection for Mortimer. Whether these accounts were exaggerated or not, the perception of infidelity was enough to shatter the fragile respect she once commanded as queen. Yet in the politically charged atmosphere of Edward's court, her scandal did not remain merely a matter of private shame. It became a weapon. Nobles discontented with the king's obsession with Hugh Despencer saw Isabella's betrayal as proof of Edward's weakness. If a king could not command the loyalty of his own wife, how could he rule a kingdom? For Edward himself, the rumors were devastating. He had already been scorned by his barons for his favoritism, and now his queen's faithlessness became a stain on his authority. But his response was not reconciliation or forgiveness, it was further cruelty. Edward and Despencer tightened their grip on power, alienating more of the nobility and driving Isabella deeper into Mortimer's arms. The court soon divided itself into factions. On one side stood the king, dominated by the Despensers, greedy and ruthless in their pursuit of power. On the other side stood those who sympathized with the Queen, nobles who saw in her affair not only scandal but a rallying cry against tyranny. Isabella and Mortimer's bond became a banner under which rebellion could form. Outside the royal household, rumors spread through taverns and marketplaces. To the common people, the Queen's betrayal carried a dangerous fascination. Stories of her treachery traveled far, painting her as a woman both despised and admired, despised for defying her king, admired for daring to strike back against him. In an age where female obedience was considered sacred, Isabella's defiance shocked Christendom. The whispers were not confined to England alone. Across the Channel, the French court listened with keen interest. Isabella was, after all, the daughter of a French king, and her treatment by Edward had long been a matter of resentment. Now, with her rebellion whispered in every corner, France saw in her scandal a chance to undermine the English throne. By the mid-1320s, Isabella and Mortimer's relationship was no longer just a private sin. It was a matter of international intrigue. The Queen's betrayal had become the talk of Europe, and Edward's authority weakened with every rumor that spread. But behind the gossip and scandal lay a truth more dangerous. Isabella was no longer simply a neglected wife or an unfaithful queen. She had begun to plot in earnest. With Mortimer at her side, she was no longer content to suffer humiliation in silence. The whispers in the court marked the beginning of a conspiracy that would soon erupt into open defiance. The Queen had crossed a line from scandal to sedition, and the Kingdom of England would soon pay the price. By the late 1320s, England was collapsing under the weight of Edward II's failures. The king's blind devotion to Hugh Despencer and his reckless mismanagement of power had left the kingdom fractured. Rebellions flared among the nobility, foreign enemies pressed at the borders, and the common people starved under heavy taxation. At the heart of this chaos stood a monarch more concerned with indulging his favorites than preserving his throne. For Isabella, the decline of Edward's reign was both a torment and an opportunity. She had endured years of humiliation, but now she recognized that her suffering was mirrored by an entire kingdom. Edward's misrule had turned barons into enemies and allies into traitors. With Roger Mortimer at her side, Isabella began to transform her personal betrayal into a political movement. The Despensers, father and son, had grown monstrously rich and powerful. Lands were confiscated from nobles, wives were imprisoned to seize their inheritances, and entire families were ruined to feed Despencer greed. Their tyranny was carried out in the king's name, but the Queen herself became one of their most prominent victims. Her properties were seized, her influence stripped, and her dignity crushed. To Edward, Isabella was no longer a partner in rule. She was a liability. This persecution forced Isabella to act. In 1325, under the pretext of a diplomatic mission, she traveled to France. Officially, she was sent to negotiate peace between her brother, Charles IV of France, and Edward II. In reality, her journey became the turning point of her life. Once in Paris, she refused to return to her husband's court, declaring that she would not return to England until the Despensers were removed from power. In France, Isabella openly aligned herself with Mortimer, who had fled imprisonment in England and found refuge across the Channel. The scandal of their affair deepened, but so too did their political strength. With French support and the wealth of discontented English exiles, Isabella and Mortimer began planning something unthinkable: the overthrow of a reigning king. The betrayal was now absolute. No longer was Isabella simply a neglected wife or a humiliated queen. She was an enemy of her husband, gathering forces in exile to strike against him. Chronicles describe her determination in chilling detail. She raised money, secured soldiers, and even arranged the betrothal of her son, Prince Edward, to strengthen her position. Every action she took tightened the noose around Edward II's reign. Meanwhile, back in England, the king's authority crumbled further. Famine and economic ruin spread suffering among the people, while Despencer's ruthless control alienated the last of the loyal nobility. The kingdom that had once stood proud now staggered under despair. To many, Isabella's betrayal no longer appeared as treason, but as salvation. By 1326, the stage was set. England was a kingdom in ruins, its king despised, its people broken. Isabella and Mortimer, once exiles, now prepared to invade with foreign allies at their side. What had begun as whispers of scandal was about to explode into open rebellion. The queen who had been silenced, dismissed, and humiliated was ready to return, not as a victim, but as a conqueror. The fall of a king was no longer a possibility. It was inevitable. In September 1326, Isabella of France crossed the English Channel at the head of an invading force. She was no longer the humiliated young queen who had been mocked in her husband's court. She returned as a conqueror, armed with soldiers, allies, and the burning fury of vengeance. At her side rode Roger Mortimer, no longer merely her secret lover, but her partner in open rebellion. Together, they would bring down the King of England. The invasion was small at first, a few ships carrying mercenaries, discontented nobles, and exiles who had fled the dispenser tyranny. But as Isabella's banner was raised on English soil, something remarkable happened. The kingdom turned against its king. Nobles who had once feared Edward and Hugh Despenser now saw in Isabella a figure of resistance. Common people, starving under taxation and weary of war, flocked to her cause. Her return to England was greeted not with hostility, but with support. Chroniclers describe entire towns opening their gates to her, welcoming the queen who had once been cast aside. To many, she represented justice. To others, she was a symbol of hope against dispenser greed. Whatever the reason, her army swelled as she marched south. Edward II was unprepared for the storm. Abandoned by allies, his authority crumbling, he fled in desperation with Hugh Despenser at his side. The sight of a king on the run, hunted by his own wife, shocked Christendom. Isabella pursued him relentlessly, determined that this time the tables would be turned. Her vengeance was merciless. Despenser loyalists were captured and executed in brutal displays meant to terrify opponents. Lands were seized, and supporters of the king were forced into submission. The very cruelty that Edward had once inflicted on Isabella now returned to him with devastating force. In November, Hugh Despenser himself was captured. His fate was one of the most horrifying punishments recorded in medieval chronicles. Condemned for treason and tyranny, he was subjected to a public execution of extraordinary brutality, hanged, disemboweled, and quartered before a jeering crowd. Some accounts claim Isabella herself watched, ensuring that the man who had humiliated her was destroyed in the most gruesome fashion possible. With Despenser's death, Edward's last shield was gone. The king was taken prisoner, humiliated, and stripped of power. For Isabella, this was not only vengeance but triumph. She had turned her scandalous affair into a revolution, transforming herself from a discarded wife into the most powerful woman in England. Yet behind the pageantry of victory lay something darker. Isabella's vengeance was not just against Despenser, it was against Edward himself. The man who had once neglected her, who had mocked her loyalty and stripped her of dignity, now stood broken, alone, and in chains. The medieval world had never witnessed such a spectacle, a queen overthrowing her king, aided by her lover, ruling openly in defiance of the sanctity of marriage and monarchy. What began as personal humiliation had erupted into a national catastrophe. Isabella's vengeance was complete. But vengeance, once unleashed, does not rest. The Queen and Mortimer now held the crown within their grasp, but how long could they rule a kingdom built on betrayal? The capture of Edward II in late 1326 marked the beginning of one of the most humiliating episodes in English royal history. A king who had once ruled with absolute authority now found himself a prisoner, stripped of dignity, abandoned by his allies, and betrayed by his own queen. His downfall was swift, merciless, and steeped in cruelty. Edward was first held at Monmouth Castle before being transferred under heavy guard. Chroniclers note how the once proud monarch, who had presided over courts of splendor, was now dragged through the countryside in rags, jeered at by those who once bowed to him. The humiliation was deliberate. Isabella and Mortimer wanted to erase the last remnants of his royal authority, reducing him to little more than a spectacle of scorn. In January 1327, Parliament assembled. For the first time in English history, a reigning king was forced to abdicate under pressure. Edward was brought before the lords and clergy, broken and defeated. They accused him of misrule, of abandoning the kingdom to ruin, of favoring dispenser above his people. Isabella's influence loomed over every word spoken, her vengeance woven into the very charges against her husband. Edward's crown was taken and passed to his teenage son, now proclaimed Edward III. The symbolism was devastating, the father dethroned, the son elevated, and the queen triumphant. Isabella and Mortimer positioned themselves as protectors of the young king, though everyone knew they were the true rulers. For Edward, the loss of his throne was only the beginning of his torment. He was imprisoned in Kenilworth Castle, guarded closely, denied any chance of escape or rallying of loyalists. Rumors spread of his despair, how he wept openly, how he begged for forgiveness, how he pleaded for a chance to live out his days in peace. But his existence was too dangerous. As long as Edward lived, he was a threat to Isabella and Mortimer's rule. The decision was made. Edward had to be eliminated. His death, however, could not be simple. A king's blood carried symbolic weight, and open execution risked rebellion. Instead, his captors plotted something more insidious, a death hidden behind prison walls, one that would remove him from the world while cloaked in mystery. Chroniclers differ on the method of his end, but all accounts agree on one point. His death was cruel, unnatural, and intended to erase both his dignity and his life. Some suggest he was starved, others that he was strangled. The most infamous version, whispered through the centuries, claims a red-hot poker was used to burn his insides without leaving external marks, a final act of humiliation, fitting for a king accused of unnatural passions. Whether this gruesome detail was fact or propaganda, the result was the same. By September 1327, Edward II was dead. The once mighty king who had ruled England for 2 decades was reduced to a pitiful corpse, silenced by betrayal and cruelty. Isabella had achieved what no queen before her dared. She had overthrown her husband, destroyed his favorites, and ruled in his stead. But her triumph carried the stench of blood and scandal. England whispered of her affair, of her vengeance, and of the horrifying fate of the king she once called husband. The fall of Edward II was not just the end of a reign. It was the revelation of how far human cruelty could go when love curdled into hatred and power demanded blood. The story of Edward II did not end with his abdication. His final months were spent not as a king, but as a shadow of a man, stripped of power, cast aside by those closest to him, and entombed in a darkness more cruel than any battlefield defeat. His imprisonment remains one of the most chilling accounts of medieval punishment, for it was not just chains that bound him, but the deliberate cruelty of betrayal. After his forced abdication in January 1327, Edward was delivered into confinement. At first, he was held in the imposing walls of Kenilworth Castle, guarded by men loyal to Isabella and Mortimer. Kenilworth was not the dankest of prisons. It was a fortress palace with halls and towers. But for Edward, it became a gilded cage. Chroniclers suggest that he was treated with a degree of dignity at first, perhaps to ease the transition and quell unrest. Yet this dignity did little to heal the deeper wounds, the humiliation of losing his crown, the betrayal of his wife, and the execution of his beloved dispenser. In the months that followed, Edward was transferred to Berkeley Castle in Gloucestershire. Here, the true torment began. Berkeley was no palace, it was a fortress of stone, cold and unyielding, with chambers fit more for confinement than for kingship. He was placed under the custody of Thomas, Lord Berkeley, and John Maltravers, men chosen precisely because they had no loyalty to the fallen monarch. The conditions of his imprisonment soon deteriorated. Chroniclers report that Edward was lodged in damp, dark chambers beneath the castle, where the stench of rot and filth was constant. He was denied the light of the sun, left to wither in isolation. Some accounts speak of foul bedding, of food laced with dirt, of calculated neglect designed not to kill him outright, but to erode his body and spirit day by day. Worse than the physical decay was the psychological torment. Edward was cut off from friends and loyalists, denied letters, and forbidden visitors. His captors wanted him forgotten, a living ghost whose existence was too dangerous to acknowledge. For a man who had once ruled in splendor, the silence and solitude were unbearable. Chroniclers suggest he raved, wept, and pleaded in his loneliness, reduced to a pitiful figure unrecognizable from the king he once was. There were rumors of crueler torments as well. Some sources claim that the guards devised ways to disturb him at night, banging on iron doors, howling in the darkness, or leaving him sleepless for days at a time. Others hint at deliberate starvation, where his meals were cut short, leaving him weak and desperate. Whether fact or embellishment, these stories reveal how Edward's captivity became a slow-motion execution, a punishment rooted in humiliation rather than mercy. It is here, in the bowels of Berkeley Castle, that Edward's humanity was stripped away piece by piece. He was not just imprisoned, he was degraded. He was meant to suffer, to be broken, to fade from memory before his body faded from life. And perhaps most haunting of all, he knew who orchestrated it. His queen, Isabella, the woman who had once shared his throne and bore him children, now presided over his downfall, her silence more damning than the walls that closed around him. The chronicles are conflicted on how Edward endured these final days, but they agree on one truth. His imprisonment was a nightmare, one that blurred the line between human cruelty and slow death. The betrayal of his wife, the triumph of his enemies, and the crushing solitude formed a torment that chains alone could never deliver. By September 1327, Edward's decline could not be hidden any longer. Whether he perished from neglect, from deliberate starvation, or by more violent means remains debated. But in the end, he was a king who died not on the battlefield, not in ceremony, but in silence, swallowed by darkness. His prison was not just made of stone, it was made of betrayal. And in that darkness, the echoes of his fall still linger, a reminder of how power and cruelty intertwine, and how even kings could be left to rot in despair. Officially, Parliament was told he had died of grief and ill health at Berkeley Castle. But almost no one believed it. His downfall had been too swift, his enemies too ruthless, and the circumstances of his confinement too cruel. From the moment his coffin left Berkeley, whispers spread of a darker truth, that Edward had been murdered in a manner so vile it would stain his queen's legacy forever. The most infamous account claims his captors killed him with a red-hot poker, forced into his body to echo the accusations of unnatural vices that had haunted his reign. If true, it was not only an execution but a final act of humiliation, designed to mock him in agony and erase his dignity as a man and king. Chroniclers describe the chamber echoing with screams until silence fell, the deed leaving no external wounds but searing pain beyond imagination. Other sources tell of quieter deaths, strangulation, starvation, or smothering with heavy blankets. These versions suggest a murder meant to appear natural, a body left without obvious violence. Yet, whether by fire or suffocation, the conclusion remained the same. Edward's life was ended deliberately, his death ordered by those who profited from his silence. For Isabella and her lover Roger Mortimer, the king's death was convenient. With Edward gone, their grip on power was secured, and the young Edward III could be ruled as a puppet. But the rumor of the poker spread quickly, whispered from noble courts to village streets. The gruesome image fixed itself in the medieval imagination, whether true or not. Legends often outlast facts, and this legend branded Isabella forever as the she-wolf of France. The manner of Edward's death mattered less than what it represented, the triumph of betrayal. A king dethroned by his wife, humiliated, and killed in secret. His reign, once marked by poor rule and corruption, was now overshadowed by the horror of his end. Chroniclers turned his fate into moral allegory, a tale of sin punished by fire and cruelty, fitting in their eyes for a man whose passions had destroyed a kingdom. But for the people of England, the story was not simply one of divine judgment. It was a haunting reminder of human cruelty. They saw a king reduced to a prisoner, a husband undone by his queen, and a death that blurred the line between justice and vengeance. The horror of his rumored murder did not just stain Isabella and Mortimer, it darkened the crown itself. Edward's son, now crowned Edward III, inherited more than a throne. He inherited a kingdom shrouded in whispers, where his father's death lingered as a scar. And though Isabella celebrated her triumph, the blood on her hands, whether real or imagined, would follow her until her own downfall. The murder of Edward II, whether by fire, strangulation, or neglect, remains one of medieval England's darkest enigmas. Yet its legacy is not in certainty, but in horror. For history remembers him not for his rule, but for the cruel way his life was ended, and for the queen who may have ordered it. With Edward II dead, Isabella of France and Roger Mortimer stood at the height of their power. They had overthrown a king, destroyed his allies, and placed young Edward III on the throne. To the world, Isabella presented herself as the devoted mother and regent, guiding her son's early reign. In reality, she and Mortimer ruled England as monarchs in all but name, and their rule quickly turned into tyranny. At first, their victory was greeted with relief. Many nobles had suffered under Edward II's corruption and Hugh Despencer's greed, and Isabella's invasion seemed to promise justice. But within months, disillusionment spread. Mortimer, who had risen from exile to power, now behaved like a king. He showered himself with lands, wealth, and titles once belonging to his enemies. He demanded to be treated as royalty, an arrogance that alarmed England's nobility. Isabella, too, lived in luxury. Chroniclers describe her enjoying rich estates and extravagant feasts, far removed from the image of the suffering queen who had once pleaded for justice. She was no longer the betrayed wife, but a ruler who reveled in the spoils of conquest. Together, Isabella and Mortimer became inseparable, their partnership openly displayed at court. To many, it seemed scandalous, a queen living openly with her lover, governing through him while her son was pushed aside. Discontent grew quickly. Taxes rose to fund Isabella's extravagance and Mortimer's ambitions. Former allies who had supported the invasion against Edward II now found themselves excluded from influence, their loyalty rewarded only with suspicion. Those who questioned Mortimer's authority risked imprisonment or worse. His rule was maintained through fear, with executions carried out against anyone he deemed a threat. The shadow of Edward II's murder also hung over them. Though the official account claimed natural death, few believed it. The rumor of the red-hot poker spread widely, and in every whisper, Isabella's name was darkened. Even Mortimer's allies could not ignore the unease. Their regime rested on a crime too obvious to be denied, even if proof was lacking. Mortimer himself grew reckless. He treated the young Edward III as a puppet, keeping him under watch and denying him real power. The boy king, though crowned, was forced to stand aside while his mother and her lover dictated the affairs of the realm. To humiliate a rightful king was dangerous, but Mortimer was blinded by ambition. He had risen too far, too fast, and now sought to secure his dominance with cruelty. For Isabella, this was a triumph laced with danger. She had gained everything she once dreamed of: freedom from her despised husband, revenge on her enemies, and rule over England. Yet her reliance on Mortimer bound her fate to his excesses. The same nobles who had once rallied to her side now saw her as complicit in his tyranny. Her transformation from wronged queen to ruthless ruler was complete, but it left her isolated, distrusted, and feared. By 1329, England was restless. Mortimer's arrogance and Isabella's scandalous partnership had eroded their support. Young Edward III was growing older, no longer a child but a teenager aware of his diminishing role. The seeds of rebellion were being sown, not from foreign enemies, but from within the very kingdom Isabella believed she controlled. The she-wolf and her lover had clawed their way to power through betrayal and blood. But tyranny, as history always shows, carries the weight of its own destruction. Isabella had won her vengeance, but her victory was already beginning to rot from within. By the early 1330s, the tides of power had begun to turn. Edward III, once a boy manipulated by his mother and Roger Mortimer, was growing into manhood. The young king could no longer tolerate being treated as a puppet. He watched as his mother flaunted her relationship with Mortimer and as his so-called guardian ruled with the arrogance of a tyrant. Every humiliation he endured planted a deeper resolve. He would reclaim the throne that had been stolen in his name. In October 1330, the moment came. Edward, only 18 years old, launched a daring coup at Nottingham Castle. With a small band of loyal companions, he crept through hidden passages into the fortress where his mother and Mortimer were lodged. The attack was swift and decisive. Mortimer, caught off guard, was dragged from Isabella's chambers as she cried out for mercy. Chroniclers describe her desperation, clutching at her lover, pleading with her son to spare him. But Edward was unmoved. For him, this was not just a coup. It was justice. Mortimer was thrown into the Tower of London, condemned without hesitation. His list of crimes was long: the unlawful killing of Edward II, the usurpation of royal authority, and the enrichment of himself at the kingdom's expense. His execution was brutal but public. Hanged at Tyburn in November 1330 as a traitor, his body left on display to erase his power and terrify his followers. With him died the reign of terror that had cast its shadow over England. For Isabella, the fall was devastating. Once the most powerful woman in Europe, she was stripped of authority and placed under house arrest. Though Edward did not execute his mother, an act that would have shocked Christendom, he made sure she would never again wield influence. Her lands were confiscated, her wealth diminished, and her movements closely watched. From Queen Regent, she was reduced to a prisoner in all but name. The humiliation was profound. Isabella, who had once orchestrated the overthrow of a king and dared to rule alongside her lover, now lived in the quiet confinement of castles chosen by her son. Chroniclers suggest she sank into bitterness, haunted by memories of betrayal and whispers of Edward II's death. She was tolerated as the king's mother, but never trusted, a living reminder of treachery and scandal. Her later years were marked by isolation. No longer surrounded by courtiers or celebrated as a queen, Isabella lingered in the shadows of the court, remembered not for her beauty or royal birth, but for the cruelty of her past. The title given to her, the she-wolf of France, followed her until her death, a curse that no repentance could erase. When she died in 1358, she was buried with honor, her body placed in the Church of the Greyfriars at London. Yet even in death, her legacy was not one of peace. History remembered her less as the daughter of a French king or the mother of an English one, and more as the queen who betrayed her husband, seized a kingdom, and fell into disgrace. Isabella's story closed not with triumph but with chains. She had reached for power through betrayal and vengeance, but power built on cruelty does not endure. In the end, she was left with silence, confinement, and the ghosts of the past. A queen without a crown, remembered more for her sins than for her rule. Isabella of France's life remains one of the most chilling scandals in medieval history. Born a princess, married a queen, and crowned a mother of kings, she seemed destined for greatness. Yet her legacy was not one of glory, but of betrayal, vengeance, and cruelty. Her story is remembered for three defining acts: her betrayal of Edward II, her open affair with Roger Mortimer, and her role in the king's downfall and death. Each of these acts shattered the sanctity of monarchy in a time when loyalty, duty, and divine right were supposed to bind rulers beyond question. Isabella broke those bonds, and the world never forgot. To her enemies, she was the she-wolf of France, a woman who embodied the darkest sides of power. The whispers of Edward II's murder, whether by starvation, suffocation, or the infamous red-hot poker, stained her name forever. Even if she did not personally order it, the belief that she sanctioned her husband's death ensured that her legacy would always reek of blood. Yet Isabella was not without skill. She played the game of power with remarkable cunning, rallying nobles, forging alliances, and turning scandal into revolution. For a time, she ruled England with absolute authority. But her triumph was poisoned by ambition. In giving herself to Mortimer's tyranny, she lost the very allies who had helped her rise. Her son's coup stripped away the illusion of strength, leaving only disgrace. Isabella's later years in quiet confinement were a living judgment. Though not executed, she endured the slow punishment of memory, silenced, sidelined, and watched. She died in 1358, buried with dignity, yet her story had already entered legend as a cautionary tale of what happens when vengeance consumes a crown. Today, her name stands as both fascination and warning. She is remembered not as a queen of peace, but as a queen of scandal, a figure who blurred the line between victim and villain. Her life proves that in the medieval world, power won through cruelty could never last, and that betrayal leaves a mark deeper than any crown. Isabella's crown was temporary. Her legacy as the she-wolf was eternal.